In a photograph taken in early 1910, the Henriksen family appears strangely peaceful. The father, Lars Henriksen, a wealthy merchant in Port Dutt. The mother, Astrid, gentle. 3 obedient children looking straight into the lens. A portrait that seemed to capture a moment of happiness. But a few days later, the whole family disappeared. Without a word, without a trace. The house was abandoned. The property was intact. The ship named Astrid Marie left port and never returned to shore. The local police thought it was a family tragedy. But more than a century later, a researcher named Harrison found forgotten records, secret reports of smuggling, illegal immigration, and a network of crimes that spread across the Great Lakes. Did the Henriksen family not disappear, but just change their name to continue living in the shadows? In the quiet summer of 2024, antique photograph appraiser David Harrison received a call that would pull him into one of Minnesota's oldest mysteries. On the other end of the line was Dr. Catherine Nelson, chief archivist of the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. Her tone was calm but curious, tinged with that certain hesitation that comes when history begins to feel alive again. The society had just acquired a box of early 20th century photographs from a recently settled estate. Most were ordinary family portraits, sepia-toned faces from a forgotten generation. But one image, Dr. Nelson explained, was different. "We have a 1910 family portrait," she said softly, "and it's connected to one of Minnesota's most puzzling unsolved disappearances." At first glance, the photograph seemed utterly normal, 5 well-dressed figures arranged in the formal style of the era. Yet, within days of that portrait being taken, the entire family vanished. No trace, no witness, not a single clue that could tell where they went or why. For Harrison, who had spent 25 years unraveling photographic mysteries, authenticating old plates, chasing half-truths through faded emulsions, this was more than a professional challenge. It was a story that seemed to whisper through the grain of the paper itself. The Minnesota Historical Society's grand stone building on Summit Avenue held the collection under soft, sterile light. Inside its climate-controlled research room, rows of documents, photographs, and personal relics lay waiting to be catalogued. Dr. Nelson placed one print on the examination table, a well-preserved 8x10 photograph of the Henriksen family, taken in Duluth, March 15th, 1910. 3 days later, on March 18th, the Henriksens disappeared from their home. No letters left behind. No sign of struggle. Just absence. Harrison studied the image carefully. The paper stock was consistent with the period. The mounting bore no signs of forgery or later tampering. Everything appeared genuine. But the knowledge of what came after the vanishing changed the photograph completely. What had once been a simple family portrait now felt like an echo frozen in time. The image showed Lars Henriksen, a dignified man in his mid-40s, standing proudly behind his seated wife. His dark suit gleamed faintly, a gold watch chain catching the light. His posture was perfect, confident, almost performative, as if he knew exactly what a man of means should look like. Beside him, Astrid Henriksen sat poised in an ornate chair, her gown heavy with intricate lace and beadwork. Her hair, styled high in the fashionable pompadour of 1910, framed a face composed yet distant. The jewelry she wore, subtle but unmistakably expensive, suggested a family accustomed to privilege. Their 3 children completed the tableau. Eric, 16, standing tall beside his father in a formal suit with a stiff collar. Ingrid, 14, dressed in a sailor-style frock popular among young women of her age, and Magnus, the youngest, perched on a small wooden stool, wearing knee breeches and high stockings, a perfect portrait of Edwardian prosperity. And yet, within 72 hours, they were gone. What happened to the Henriksons after that March afternoon? Was it an accident, a crime, or something far stranger that never found its way into the official record? No one could say for certain. But as Harrison leaned closer over the glass, it was hard not to feel that the family frozen forever in monochrome stillness was somehow looking back. The studio backdrop behind the Henriksen family was elaborate painted marble columns, trailing ivy, and a soft illusion of a garden fading into distance. It was the kind of refined setting used by the most prestigious portrait studios in Minneapolis and St. Paul, meant to lend an air of timeless dignity to those who could afford it. The photographer had arranged the lighting with professional care, the illumination falling evenly across all 5 faces. No harsh shadows, no awkward contrast. Just perfect technical balance, the work of a master who knew exactly how to capture not only likeness, but status. To David Harrison's trained eye, every element of the portrait was correct for 1910. The mounting, the tones, the textures, all of it authentic. The Henriksons' clothing, their jewelry. The very way they held themselves spoke of wealth and social ambition. They were part of a new class of Minnesotans who had prospered after the mining and timber booms, families who built fortunes from the raw power of the state's northern frontiers. Absolutely nothing in the photograph hinted at the horror that would follow. There were no strange shadows, no anxious expressions, just a confident family, frozen in time, moments before they were to vanish from history. Dr. Nelson handed Harrison a thick file of documents, the original case record from 1910. Its yellowed pages told a story that had haunted the region for more than a century. According to the Duluth Police Department, the Henriksen family had been reported missing on March 19th, 1910. Lars Henriksen had failed to appear for several important business meetings. When their household staff entered the residence, they found it silent and abandoned. The Henriksens' grand Victorian home on Superior Street stood immaculate. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Every door and window had been locked from the inside. The rooms were untouched, furniture perfectly arranged, a tea service half cleaned in the kitchen, the faint scent of perfume still lingering in Astrid's dressing room. All of the family's valuable possessions remained in place, jewelry heirlooms, fine silver. Yet, the most unsettling detail was this: the Henriksens seemed to have left of their own accord, but took almost nothing with them. Their wardrobes were full. Personal effects, hairbrushes, cufflinks, letters were undisturbed. Even the smallest daily necessities like toiletries and medicines sat waiting, as though the family had stepped out for an evening walk and never returned. Only the clothing they had been wearing was gone. No luggage, no provisions, no evidence of preparation for a journey of any kind. Financial records revealed nothing suspicious. Lars had not withdrawn any significant sums. His accounts were stable, his business dealings perfectly orderly. There was no sign of debt, blackmail, or scandal that could explain a sudden flight. The housekeeper and groundskeeper both testified that they had last seen the Henriksons on the evening of March 17th. The family had seemed entirely normal, calm content, engaged in their usual nightly routine. No mention of travel, no sign of distress. Over the following weeks, the Duluth police conducted a sweeping investigation. They scoured the shoreline of Lake Superior, interviewed business partners, friends and servants, and followed every rumored sighting across Minnesota and neighboring states. Yet, not a single trace of the 5 missing Henriksons was ever found. It was as though the entire family had been quietly erased, lifted from the world, leaving behind only their perfectly ordered home and one haunting photograph. Harrison's curiosity deepened. He began to reconstruct their lives in Duluth as they had been in 1910, examining business records, personal correspondence, and newspaper archives in search of something that might explain their disappearance. His research at the St. Louis County Historical Society revealed that Lars Henriksen had been more than a successful businessman. He had been a figure of local influence. He owned several ore ships that carried iron from the Mesabi Range to the great steel mills of Ohio and Pennsylvania. It was a trade that had made him rich, very rich, during the height of Minnesota's mining boom. And yet, as Harrison read deeper into the Henriksen papers, a strange unease began to grow. Because every prosperous family leaves traces, letters, rumors, death's enemies. And yet, for the Henriksons, there was almost nothing. It was as if their story had been carefully erased. The pages of the Duluth News Tribune from early 1910 whispered of Lars Henriksen in the small, sober columns that recorded a town's comings and goings. He appeared as a man on the move, expanding dock facilities at the port, promising new investments in shipping technology that would, he claimed, make the transport of ore faster and more profitable. To the town, he was a businessman, building on the fortunes of the Mesabi Range. But when Harrison dug deeper, the newspaper lines began to thicken into something less tidy. Reports from February 1910 spoke of labor unrest across ore shipping firms, complaints about working conditions, whispered worries about safety aboard Great Lakes freighters. Lars's name might not have been called out in every article, yet the agitation affected the whole industry. And then, in early March, a brief note in the Duluth Herald flickered like a signal. Federal investigators were probing shipping practices and the business ties that bound several Great Lakes transportation companies. Officials, the piece suggested, were looking into possible violations of interstate commerce laws. The timing was curious, too close for comfort. Weeks before the Henriksen family vanished, questions of federal scrutiny were already floating in the press. Harrison felt that old familiar tug of a case that might be bigger than the local officers had imagined. He decided to follow the thread where it led into federal records and back through the original police files, searching for details that local investigators, naturally focused on what was nearest, might have missed. What he found in the National Archives changed the shape of the mystery. The Department of Commerce and Labor had been quietly conducting a wide inquiry into ore shipping companies suspected of bending or breaking federal rules. The investigators were not looking only for bookkeeping errors. Their files described schemes to manipulate cargo weights and shipping logs, underreporting tonnage, so companies could dodge fees and taxes while pockets grew heavier. More disturbing still were notes about falsified safety inspections and vessels that did not meet federally mandated standards. Those lapses, the records suggested, had led to accidents and injuries that were smoothed over on paper. And then Harrison found the line that made his breath catch. Lars Henriksen's company was named in the federal files. Investigators had flagged discrepancies in Henriksen's cargo reports that suggested systematic underreporting over several years. Crucially, the files indicated that federal agents planned to interview Lars during the week of March 21st, 1910, only days after the family's disappearance. Had the Henriksens learned they were about to be questioned by the feds? Did fear of indictment send them running? It was a tidy hypothesis until Harrison noticed another less tidy fact. Other shipping owners under federal scrutiny had stayed in town. Many negotiated settlements, paid fines, and agreed to reforms without fleeing or facing criminal prosecution. Why then would Lars have chosen to vanish rather than seek the same accommodations? Harrison pressed on. He widened his search through the confidential strands of the investigation and uncovered something darker. Hidden within those federal files were intimations of a far more serious conspiracy than mere tariff evasion, international smuggling, and illegal immigration. According to the confidential notes, some warships were being used to move people clandestinely from Canada into the United States. Men, women, perhaps entire families were said to have been concealed in specially constructed compartments within the cargo holds, hulks that on the ledger appeared to carry only iron ore. Imagine that scene for a moment, the hollowed space beneath a mountain of ore, a secret room that breathed under the ship's keel, the muffled presence of humans counted as cargo. If true, such an operation would carry consequences far beyond a fine. Criminal exposure scandal, perhaps even blackmail reasons one could imagine strong enough to prompt desperate choices. So Harrison returned again and again to the same question that now seemed to pulse behind every paper trail if federal investigators were closing in on a smuggling ring that hid people beneath ore. Might that peril explain why the Henriksens disappeared so suddenly without luggage, without money, without a note? Or was there something else even stranger waiting in the dark between those pages? Would you, hearing such a thing, have stayed to face it or run? The deeper Harrison read, the darker the picture became. The smuggling ring that had drawn the Henriksens into its orbit wasn't just about evading taxes or concealing cargo weights. It was something far more sinister, something that thrived on human desperation. Federal files described how the operation had grown rich by charging desperate immigrants enormous fees for passage to American industrial cities. To men and women fleeing poverty in Europe, those ships must have seemed like salvation. But once across the water, many found that their freedom had been purchased only to be sold again. Investigators had uncovered evidence that the network's profits came not only from transportation but from human trafficking. Those who had been smuggled aboard warships were often forced into brutal labor contracts, threatened with deportation if they dared to complain, beaten, or vanished if they tried to flee. Some were pressed into servitude in factories. Others, the files noted grimly, into brothels or domestic labor in faraway cities. And then came the line that froze Harrison where he sat. There was evidence that children and young women had been among those trafficked through the same network, and that Lars Henriksen's company had played a part in it. The words on the page were careful, bureaucratic, but their meaning was unmistakable. If proven true, the charges would have carried sentences measured not in years but in decades. Federal agents had been preparing for coordinated raids on March 22, 1910, intending to seize records, arrest key figures, and dismantle the entire smuggling web. But the files also hinted at rot within the system itself. The investigators suspected that corrupt officials, men with badges, and access to sealed documents were leaking information to the smugglers. Time and again, those about to be arrested simply vanished in the days before agents arrived. That pattern fit the Hendricksons perfectly. They had disappeared on March 18th, 4 days before the scheduled arrests. Enough time to prepare to move, to disappear. For the first time, Harrison began to see the case not as a supernatural vanishing, but as a carefully orchestrated escape by a family who knew they were about to lose everything. Still, something in the story refused to sit neatly. The files painted Lars Henriksen as cold and calculating, but would his wife, Astrid, his children, have gone willingly into exile? Or had they been swept along in a current they couldn't control? Harrison followed the clues into the logistics of disappearance. The federal documents detailed the smugglers' infrastructure, a chain of safe houses and secret routes stretching from the Canadian border through Minnesota and into major American cities. The network was so well designed that whole groups could move unseen through forests over frozen lakes and across the border where officials rarely ventured. In the remote north of Minnesota, several safe houses had been mapped by investigators, old lumber cabins, and disused hunting lodges miles from any railway line. Hidden places deliberately chosen for their silence. The immigrants would wait until arrangements were made to move them onward. But it was the maritime records that struck hardest. Federal investigators had identified several Great Lakes vessels that had been modified for smuggling ships with false bulkheads, secret storage chambers, even hidden ladders leading to concealed decks below the cargo holds. These ships could slip into small coves or isolated docks at night, unloading their human cargo unseen. And one such vessel, the Astrid Marie, bore a name that Harrison instantly recognized. It was Lars Henriksen's ship, christened after his wife. Records showed that it had departed Duluth Harbor on the evening of March 18, 1910, the very day the family vanished. Its manifest claimed a routine cargo of iron ore bound for Cleveland. It never arrived. Somewhere on the Great Lakes, it had simply disappeared. No wreckage, no distress call, just silence. Federal investigators at the time had suspected that the Astrid Marie had been deliberately sunk or hidden, its evidence gone with it. Yet, even that explanation raised questions. If the Hendricksons were aboard, had they scuttled their own vessel to cover their flight? Or had someone else ensured they would never tell what they knew? Harrison leaned back from the files, the pages trembling faintly in his hands. The pieces fit too perfectly, and yet too tragically. A family once admired for their wealth and poise, vanishing not by fate or accident, but through their own dark creation. Still, he couldn't shake a lingering thought, one that seemed to hum just beneath the surface of the paper. If the Astrid Marie had gone down somewhere on that vast inland sea, and if the Hendricksons had been aboard, then what exactly had the De Veers who later searched those waters been told to look for? And what might still be resting unseen beneath the cold waves of Lake Superior? Harrison's research painted a haunting portrait of a family that seemed to vanish not once, but twice. Their home in Duluth had been abandoned with eerie precision, not a single item taken in haste, no evidence of struggle. Everything about their disappearance whispered of preparation of a plan, long in place for the day their secrets would no longer stay buried. Through the yellowed pages of Canadian immigration archives, Harrison began to trace faint echoes of their passage shadows on official records from the spring of 1910. Several entries described small Scandinavian families arriving by private boats along remote stretches of the Ontario and Manitoba border, far from any legal crossing. None bore the Henriksen name, but one family stood out. A Norwegian couple, Mr. and Mrs. Larsen and their 3 children. Their arrival in Winnipeg came only days after the Henriksens had vanished. Their ages, their number, even the pattern of their journey matched precisely. They paid cash a large sum for a sprawling farm on the outskirts of the city. The paperwork claimed they had come from Norway by way of Montreal, but inconsistencies in their documents hinted at something carefully forged. Immigration officials noted the oddities, but money, as it so often does, softened suspicion. Within months, the Larsen family had blended perfectly into the Scandinavian community of Winnipeg. They attended church, spoke fluent Norwegian, invested in businesses, and became known for their quiet generosity towards struggling immigrants. They helped newcomers find work, offered loans without interest, and shared resources freely. To the community, they were a blessing. But to Harrison, it all sounded like a pattern, people who understood perhaps too well what it meant to start over with hidden names and a past best left unspoken. By 1915, the Larsens were prospering, until suddenly they vanished again. The farm was sold, their businesses dissolved, and local papers noted only that they had moved to relatives in the United States. But no relatives were ever found. Harrison uncovered what had likely triggered their second disappearance. By that year, the world was at war and cooperation between the United States and Canada had deepened. Criminal records, photographs, and wanted lists were being shared across borders for the first time. Among those names was Lars Henriksen, once a respected shipping magnate, now a fugitive wanted for human trafficking and smuggling. The timing fit too neatly to be coincidence. As the net tightened, the Larsen family quietly purchased train tickets on the Canadian Pacific Railway, their destination, Vancouver, British Columbia. Beyond that, the trail turned cold once more. Did they slip away on a ship bound for Asia, or vanish into some quiet coastal village living under yet another name? Harrison could never be certain. But one thing was clear: the Henriksens, or the Larsens as they called themselves, were ghosts who had mastered the art of disappearance. And somewhere along the western edge of the continent, perhaps under a name no record would ever reveal, their story faded once again into silence. If you were Harrison, staring at the last trace of that family, a faded passenger manifest bound for Vancouver, would you close the file? Or would you keep searching just to know if they ever made it out alive? By the time Harrison reached the final pages of his research, the trail had grown thin but not entirely cold. The last tangible trace of the Henriksens, or the Larsens, as they had briefly called themselves, came from a small entry in the Canadian Pacific Railway records. Tickets purchased in March 1915. Paid for entirely in cash. No return trip listed. And the names, none that matched any known identity. Each one carefully chosen as if the family had rehearsed this performance many times before. From there, Harrison followed their ghostly path west toward the port city of Vancouver. And it was there in the archives of the Harbour Office that he found one more whisper of their escape. Passenger manifests from 1915 listed several ships departing for distant destinations: Australia, Buenos Aires, Yokohama. On some blank spaces appeared where names should have been. Others included only initials or false entries written in the same looping hand. Somewhere among them, Harrison was certain the Hendricksons had found passage to a new beginning. Their escape had not been desperate, but deliberate. Lars Henriksen had been no ordinary fugitive. He was a man who had planned for this outcome long before the first knock came on his door. He had transferred vast sums out of the United States years earlier enough to secure new lives across oceans. Wherever they went, be it the quiet coastlines of South America or the shadowed ports of Asia, the Hendricksons had the means to begin again, to vanish among those who never asked questions. It was a bitter realization. Their disappearance was not a mystery born of tragedy, but a triumph of calculation. A family of traffickers and smugglers who had profited from human desperation and then used that same desperation to cover their escape. By the 1920s, American authorities had quietly closed the case. Reports in the federal files noted that the Hendrickson matter is presumed resolved. Some believed the family had perished at sea. Others suspected they had built comfortable new lives in places where extradition was little more than a foreign word. The arrests that followed swept up lesser men, ship captains, middlemen, clerks. But the heart of the operation, the mind behind it all, was gone. The escape of Lars Henriksen had robbed investigators of crucial testimony and allowed others to rewrite their own guilt, claiming they were merely following orders. Worse still, the case had become a model proof to other criminals that if you had enough money, enough foresight, and enough nerve, you could erase yourself completely. And so all that remains is a single photograph, a family portrait taken just days before the vanishing. Lars, his wife Astrid, and their 3 children. Perfectly posed, perfectly ordinary. The kind of picture a family might send to relatives overseas. But Harrison knew better. That photograph was not a keepsake. It was a mask, the final record of a family that had already begun to disappear. As he closed his report for the Minnesota Historical Society, Harrison wrote a single line beneath the final image, "Appearances deceive." Behind every smile may lie a secret that outlives its century. And perhaps tonight, as you look at that same photograph, the one with the neatly dressed children and the proud father at the center, you might ask yourself, if evil wore such a calm face, would you recognize it? Or would you, too, believe you were simply looking at a family preparing for dinner, unaware that within days they would be gone forever?